It is really a great pleasure to be able to welcome David Cohen here to Aspen this year as our dinner speaker. David, as I would imagine most, if not all of you know, is the Executive Vice President of Comcast. It's a position that he has held since 2002. He is responsible for an exceptionally broad portfolio of activities, including corporate communications, government regulatory affairs, public affairs, legal affairs, corporate administration, and community investment. He serves as a senior counselor to the CEO, as well as chief diversity officer. He's been responsible for shepherding through major Comcast acquisitions, including the NBC Universal acquisition and currently the Time Warner Cable acquisition. Prior to joining Comcast, David was a partner and chairman of the law firm of Ballard, Spahr, Andrews, and Ingersoll. He has a long list of board memberships, including chairman of the trustees of the University of Pennsylvania, the board of Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce, trustee of City Year, board of National Urban League, and corporate advisory board of the National Council of La Raza. He also has a very long list of awards for civic and charitable activities and honors, including honorary doctorates from Drexel University and Rider University. David has been variously characterized in the press as Comcast's real repairman, Comcast's secret weapon, and part wonk, part rock star. Between 1992 and 1997, David served as chief of staff to Philadelphia Mayor Ed Rendell, who said of him what anyone who has seen David in action knows. He said, whatever the issue is, David learns more about it than anyone, and he can keep it all in his head. With me, he knew all about municipal pensions, and he knew all about picking up the trash. I mean, the actual routes of the garbage trucks. Amy Gutman, president of the University of Pennsylvania, where David serves as chairman of the Board of Trustees, said of him, David is intellectually omnivorous. It's extremely important to have people like David who appreciate what politics is at its best and who get things done. That combination is very rare. It's a great pleasure to introduce David Cohen.
So good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here, and really an honor to be your keynote speaker tonight. And I know every speech that you've ever heard starts with the speaker saying what a pleasure it is to be here. But to add some credibility to that, this is actually right smack in the middle of my vacation, and put it on pause to be able to come out here and be able to speak at the TPI Aspen Forum. So it really is a pleasure and a matter of choice for me to be here. TPI has become one of the great policy organizations in America. Its central area of inquiry, the economics of technological change, has never been more important. Our economy is simply not growing as fast as it should, and to keep our recovery going, we need to ensure that rational economic analysis of challenges we face does not get drowned out by the considerable noise that exists in Washington these days. And that's what makes the work of Tom and Scott and their colleagues at TPI so valuable. For all of us working in communications and tech policy, there's been no shortage of action this year raising core issues that you're exploring at this meeting. Policymakers face decisions today that will influence our communications, entertainment, and high-tech industries for decades to come. These industries are areas of real competitive advantage and growth opportunity for America. And every step government takes can have real consequences, good or bad, for their future. Just by way of example, and I could do a number of examples, in January, the DC Circuit ensured that the debate over internet regulation would be front and center this year when it struck down significant portions of the FCC's 2010 Open Internet Order. Regulators have to assess all these issues in a world where technology is changing so fast that whole industries seem to come and go in no time. In 2005, Blockbuster looked so dominant in home video that FTC antitrust concerns barred it from acquiring the competitor Hollywood Video. Anyone seen any Blockbusters around recently? But today, virtually the entire bricks and mortar video rental industry has all but disappeared. This is the challenging environment our regulators work in, and that's why I've always had enormous respect for their great public service, even when I don't agree with what they do all the time. Over the years, economists have analyzed how the pace of change in technology sectors makes them different from many other sectors. Gary Becker, William Baumol, and Jeff Eisenach have analyzed how technology sectors are characterized by firms that compete by investing to innovate and then use that innovation to differentiate their products. They refer to this cycle of competition driven by investment, innovation, and product differentiation as dynamic competition. And Uber is a good example of this. Uber didn't go out and buy or lease a fleet of cars or go through the same business building processes as the taxi business did in order for Uber to compete with taxis. Instead, they created an entirely different service powered by their innovative mobile app and back-end processes. Another good example of dynamic competition is a little bit closer to my heart, and that's what's happened to broadband in America. A slow telco reaction to the emergence of the internet gave cable companies the chance to leap ahead in broadband in the mid-90s, which prodded the telcos to invest more in DSL and then fiber, which then motivated cable to push the envelope with DOCSIS 3.0, and the agenda expanded by innovating anew in fiber and advanced DSL. And faster and more robust wireless broadband infrastructure, and now cable is working feverishly on its own fiber build and DOCSIS 3.1, and the leapfrogging of innovation and investment and competition continues. Unfortunately, although we at Comcast live this competitive world every day, some commentators ignore these complex but very real dynamics when they analyze the state of the broadband market today. They too often rely on an overly simplistic and anachronistic model, where edge companies create content and services, ISPs provide pipes that bring those services to consumers, and consumers sit in front of their computer and passively take them in. That may have been how things worked when Hayes modems ruled the world and we measured connectivity in baud. But of course, that's not the way the world works today. Today, edge companies generate enormous amounts of content and services, but they also have their own big networks to move their data, including operating their own content delivery networks. Comcast, of course, is a customer-facing ISP, but we also haul a lot of traffic for ourselves and others, and we design software like our innovative X1 platform that has a voice interface that digs out movies, TV shows, and actors when you speak to it. And obviously, consumers don't sit passively in front of their televisions or computers anymore. They create content and share it. They live on multiple screens. They view their video and enjoy their video in a mobile fashion. And they, bottom line, have a fundamental expectation that they can access internet and video services wherever and whenever they want on whatever their device of choice might be. This amazing new world of mobility is enabled by wireless and wired broadband working together. Wi-Fi is not just a way to access wired broadband, it's also a conduit for wireless broadband. According to Cisco, an amazing 88% of all US data traffic on mobile and portable devices will travel over Wi-Fi by 2018. Too many commentators also assume that the broadband market structure is static. Anyone who just looks at today's picture, or even worse, yesterday's picture, and not tomorrow's, will get this badly wrong. Take DSL-based broadband as an example. People declared it dead several years ago. But like the famous scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, it's not dead yet. Far from it. Telephone companies are aggressively upgrading legacy DSL to new VDSL. AT&T's $6 billion Project VIP wireline investment program that was announced in late 2012 is just one example. And this upgraded DSL is a serious competitor to cable modem technology, providing speeds today up to 45 meg down, with plans to increase to 75 and 100 meg down. And the next generation of DSL services is already being field tested at 700 meg down or faster. The results of this competition are clear. Contrary to DSL being dead, between December 2008 and December 2012, DSL-based broadband connections, which include upgraded DSL services, grew at an average annual rate of 25%, exceeding cable broadband's pace of growth at an average annual rate of 18%. Every time I give those statistics, somebody comes up to me and says, those can't be right, that they've been double and triple checked, and they are right. That in fact, the average annual growth rates for DSL over the past 5 years have outpaced the average annual growth rates of cable broadband. And of course, the growth of wireless in speed, capacity, and share of internet use is changing the entire landscape. So the continuing pace of change should provide at least a blinking light of caution to regulators and advocates. The warning is simple. Don't overestimate your ability to shape markets and predict their future course. Government can do a lot of things, but accurately predicting the fast pace of technological change has never been a government strength, and I don't think it's a government strength today. So within that framework, which should be familiar to everyone who looks at TPI and the work that TPI does, I'd like to briefly comment on 3 specific policy issues on the Washington agenda today: net neutrality, consolidation, and the international landscape. So on net neutrality, let me make one very clear statement. Comcast strongly, unequivocally, and absolutely supports a free and open internet. We support net neutrality. And we support, it shouldn't be an ovation. We've only run millions of dollars of advertising making this point, but it drives me a little bit crazy when I read that we actually really don't support net neutrality. We really do. And we also support the FCC putting in place legally enforceable rules to ensure that there is a free and open internet, including strong transparency, no blocking, and anti-discrimination rules. We publicly and strongly supported the FCC's 2010 open internet rules. We believe that those rules struck the proper balance between protecting consumer interests and respecting our rights to manage our network reasonably, while maintaining our incentive to keep investing, and with our investment, empowering continuous innovation on the internet. Our support of the 2010 open internet order was so strong that we voluntarily agreed in our NBC Universal transaction to be bound by those rules, even if they were struck down by the courts, which they were. And that's why we're the only company in America today operating under the entire set of the 2010 rules. And we're fine with that, because they don't prevent us from doing anything that we'd be interested in doing. We've also pledged to extend that commitment to all Time Warner Cable systems that will become part of Comcast if our merger is approved. Now that the DC Circuit has struck down key parts of the 2010 open internet order, we still strongly support the enactment of permanent open internet rules to cover the entire industry. And we support the process that Chairman Wheeler has put in place to achieve that. We believe that the DC Circuit's decision has, for the first time, laid out a clear path and clear authority under Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act for the FCC to adopt robust and legally enforceable open internet rules. And we've been public about our support in blogs, testimony, comments filed at the FCC, and even in our advertising. So we support net neutrality rules because we believe in the continued growth of the internet, in the continued innovation that growth will produce, and in the economic and jobs impact of that growth. Internet edge providers and ISPs are partners in growing the internet and our innovation economy. We are not enemies in how to accomplish those goals. So I hope I've made clear where we stand on net neutrality. The only open question is how we can best get to that balanced and workable outcome. So as strongly as we support legally enforceable net neutrality rules, we firmly believe the right balance cannot be achieved by reclassifying broadband as a telecommunications service under Title II. That would be bad for our industry, bad for the internet ecosystem, and bad for our country. Title II regulations would destabilize the current broadband economy and seriously stifle investment and innovation. I doubt that we, AT&T, Verizon, Charter, Cox, CenturyLink, Sprint, T-Mobile, and so many others would have kept innovating and expanding our networks at rates anywhere close to what we have been doing if we faced traditional common carrier rules, price controls, and who knows what else under Title II. No rational economic actor would. The likely impact of Title II reclassification on investment and network deployment is not a matter of scaremongering. When the FCC merely mentioned the possibility of reclassifying broadband under Title II in May 2010, in the days that immediately followed, it had the investment-chilling effect of erasing 10% and more of some ISPs' market capitalization, literally in a 10-day period. University of Pennsylvania professor Christopher Yu recently compared the US approach to broadband regulation with the European approach, which mirrors Title II. He found the US approach has led to far wider deployment of high-speed networks, with 82% of America served compared to just 54% of the European Union. And at the end of 2012, EU broadband investment on a per household basis stood at less than half of the US level of investment. Plainly, Title II style rules have stifled broadband investment overseas, and there's no reason to expect that the same would not occur in the United States. Moreover, we need to create jobs for our growing population and for all those who lost jobs due to the recession. The broadband and communications sectors have been a major contributor to job creation, and heavy-handed Title II regulation would undeniably hurt our ability to continue to contribute in the jobs creation space. Again, we don't have to look any further than Europe with its Title II type regulations. From 2000 to 2009, McKinsey Global Institute found the number of people working in the telecommunications sector in 9 of the EU's markets declined by 26%. By contrast, here in the US, the Progressive Policy Institute found that in just 1 year, from 2012 to 2013, apps-related jobs alone grew by 40%, driven by a robust broadband sector. So if all these facts are not sufficiently persuasive, then I'd like to refer everyone to the White House's 4 years of broadband growth report, which was released in June 2013. And in my judgment, that report should put this issue to rest once and for all. That report identified extraordinary broadband successes in America and attributed them to American broadband providers' investment of private capital at record rates even through the recession. The White House noted that 2 of the largest broadband providers alone invested more in America during the 2011 fiscal year than the top 5 oil and gas companies, and nearly 5 times more than the big 3 auto companies combined. These investments are one of the foundations of the US internet and apps economy that is the envy of the world. This virtuous cycle is founded on 2 decades of a bipartisan commitment to light touch regulatory policies. The White House agreed when it said its, quote, light touch, multi-stakeholder policies to build opportunity and trust, unquote, is a, quote, comprehensive approach, unquote, that is, quote, improving the efficiency and predictability of the digital economy, unquote. In fact, the White House specifically mentioned the FCC's 2010 Open Internet Order as an example, as a successful example of this light touch approach at work. So as America chooses the path to net neutrality and decides whether Section 706 or Title II is the way to get there, we have to ask some fundamental questions. Does anyone look at our dynamic, rapidly evolving broadband networks and see a system that's failing? When people call for utility-style regulation, do they really want the internet to look like our electricity, highway, and other infrastructure markets, all of which are lagging the world? Do we want to take a rare bright spot of the US economy and dim it instead of continuing to grow it? Fortunately, we don't need to go there. We need to find a sensible middle to develop workable solutions rather than creating rancor and animosity. I hate the notion that finding the middle ground and looking for sensible compromise and developing rational solutions to complicated problems has become something quaint and unachievable in Washington. But I believe that's the approach that's badly needed today in communications and tech policy and throughout our economy. So just last month, the Philadelphia Fed found that the partisanship everywhere, not just in Congress, directly caused employment to drop by 1.5 million workers after 6 quarters. When that's what we face, how can we not try to work together to get things done by pursuing sensible solutions rather than radical regulations that are not properly grounded either in public policy or in economic policy? Enough on that topic. Let me talk about consolidation, and I really do promise that I will only briefly comment on our pending transaction with Time Warner Cable, but judging on the cocktail party conversation, it is the 800-pound elephant in the room, so I think I need to say something about it. So I'm not going to dwell on how there are no horizontal antitrust concerns here, because there's not much more to say about that. The two companies simply don't compete for customers in any market. I won't spend your time repeating that there are no market concentration concerns, because after the merger we'll remain below the 30% FCC ownership cap, a limit that the courts have twice ruled is too low to raise vertical issues. I also won't belabor our response to the outlandish and factually unsupportable claims about our supposed post-transaction share of broadband connections across the country. Of course, there is no relevant national broadband market to begin with, since broadband competition among ISPs is highly local in nature. After all, what does it matter if Comcast is going to control the ISP market in Philadelphia and in Los Angeles, since nobody in Philadelphia can buy broadband from a Los Angeles provider and nobody from Los Angeles can buy broadband from a Philadelphia provider. But most importantly, assertions that our share post-transaction will be upwards of 50% simply ignore the actual evidence. Our post-transaction share of wired broadband connections will be about 35% based on the FCC's most recent data, and even that statistic ignores marketplace developments happening every day, including the dizzying growth of 4G LTE wireless connections, which, if included, would reduce our post-transaction share to a little over 15%. I also won't run through the long litany of consumer benefits, including faster broadband speeds, more streaming, more on-demand video options, the expansion of our best-in-class X1 platform, the ability to deploy all of our other advanced technology and services through this transaction, our commitment to diversity, our industry-leading Internet Essentials program, and a whole host of other consumer benefits that the opponents to the transaction conveniently, literally ignore, do not address at all. The one issue, after said I'm not going to do any of those things, it's when I reread this, it sort of struck me, if I'm saying I'm not going to do it, then spend 5 minutes doing it. But the one issue I actually do want to discuss seems to be at the heart of a lot of the opposition to our transaction, and that's the view that any merger between large companies should be opposed because big is always bad. So to be sure, big is sometimes bad. After the financial crisis and the debates around too big to fail, financial institutions, skepticism around largeness of size is understandable. But I think we have to look at every case separately based on facts and analysis, and above all, anchored by antitrust principles and laws. As Scott Walston has written, the big is bad, so bigger is worse argument is not generically true. As Scott observes, large firms do some things better, and small firms do other things better. In a leading paper that Michael Katz and Howard Shalansky wrote in 2007, they also reached the same conclusion. They said that in some instances, innovation may be greater where concentration is greater. So if we are to continue to promote innovation, we must look at the size and concentration of markets on a case-by-case basis. And in the case of our transaction with Time Warner Cable, with a recognition of our dynamic, quickly changing market and a world of striving, competing, innovative firms. The primary business rationale underlying our merger with Time Warner Cable is that it will provide us with the increased scale to invest and innovate more in both residential and business services. Here, the scale efficiencies are key, because we are in a sector where most of our costs are fixed, or at least do not grow proportionally to the increase in scale. This leads to more investments meeting the hurdle rate and being profitably undertaken, which in turn will lead to more innovation being generated. This is precisely how the long-run consumer welfare effects that Shalansky and Katz wrote about emerge, and I don't know that there's a transaction out there that makes this case as compelling, in as compelling a fashion as the combination between Comcast and Time Warner Cable. So let me close with a few thoughts on international internet governance, and these are issues that have become so prominent. So although Comcast is primarily a domestic business, the growth and freedom of the internet globally is fundamental to our business and to other American businesses, as well as to economic, social, and political process throughout the world. So as a US citizen, as a global citizen, the international governance crisis, if I can call it that, is very important to our company. And here too, I think we're at a time of dynamic transition and change, and potentially dangerous change. Just as traditional industry and product boundaries are breaking down, so too are national and institutional boundaries, like, for example, the shifting roles of ICANN, the ITU, and IGF. And just as the debates around core policy issues are fluid and fundamental, the trajectory of international policy and governance issues grows more complex and uncertain. As Ambassador Sepulveda, who is with us here tonight, didn't even know that when I wanted to use this, noted at the IGF USA this summer, and I quote, "Centralizing control over the global internet in the hands of governments risks breaking it. It is not a risk worth taking." And we couldn't agree more with that. As the ambassador went on to note, and I quote again, "Networks should continue to interconnect internationally through commercial arrangement on the basis of consensus-based voluntary standards. And as governments, we should focus on building enabling legal and regulatory environments that encourage and reward investments in broadband infrastructure, in the services that ride over that infrastructure, and in the skills people need to use internet access for productive purposes," unquote. And I think in two quotes, Ambassador Sepulveda has totally captured certainly what the US position is and what how all thinking people should approach international governance issues. And note, if you will, the parallel nature of my discussion on the open internet and keeping our eye on the ball of investment leading to innovation, and how this US policy in the international governance debates, what the ambassador described to me as his job is now like participating in endless seminars where people talk endlessly about these issues, but the bottom line goal is to make sure that we have an environment where investment is encouraged, innovation can occur, and ultimately jobs and economic development are created out of that investment and out of that innovation. So we're going to continue to work with others to develop practices and principles that work across borders and that stick over time. These must be forward-looking and flexible, able to adapt as the internet grows and reshapes itself, and sensitive to the interconnected nature of the internet ecosystem overall. Poor decisions that harm one part of the ecosystem will inevitably drag down the whole. At the same time, if we get this right, we can promote economic growth, create jobs, and narrow the digital divide across the globe. The same goals that we have here at home for our own broadband industry. So let me conclude with one more quote, and what better quote to conclude with than at a TPI event than from TPI's mission statement. Government should intervene in these dynamic markets only when markets fail and when proposed solutions will demonstrably improve society's well-being. It's a short statement, but one with a lot to offer policymakers and regulators. A recognition that when markets are dynamic, policymakers should proceed with caution, and only where it is quite clear that intervention will make things better, not worse. I certainly wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment, with that mission statement, and hope that the nation and the world will sign on to that vision of when and how government regulation and intervention is appropriate. So thanks again for the opportunity to speak here tonight, and happy to take some questions. Let me get a drink of water and then I'll take questions.
Let me take the prerogative of asking the first question. We had one of our sessions this morning was on the political economy of telecom. Was on the political economy of telecom reform, which is one subject you didn't touch on in your talk. And obviously, as you know, the Energy and Commerce Committee is looking into this in considerable detail, issuing white papers and soliciting comment. So basically, two questions. One is, what is your prognosis in terms of the likelihood of communications reform legislation being enacted in the next Congress, and what would you like to see in any telecom reform?
So if there's one thing where there seems to be a consensus, it would be that it's time to reform the 1996 Telecommunications Act. And unfortunately, that's right about where the consensus ends. As soon as you start talking about, well, what would you like to do, it's hard to develop any consensus at this point. So, it's been a while since 1996, and there are clearly many elements of the 96 Act that are anachronistic and no longer make any sense. And I actually think there's probably a fair amount of consensus around many of those. But I do think that if you're going to approach this in a rational, policy-driven way, and I know it's not necessarily the way we approach anything in Washington, but in a fantasy world, I'd like to think that that's the way you would try and do this, that you should start by seeing whether there's any consensus around a set of high-level principles and propositions. And I know Phil Weiser talked today through one such proposition out, which is the need to facilitate, encourage, and grow innovation. I actually think that's a high-level principle that could gain significant consensus. But you need to have a collection of those and then have a compact that in doing the reform of the Act, we're going to include only elements of reform that enable us to accomplish the high-level principles that we have a consensus about. I consider myself a student of the political process. I'm not a critic of the political process. I'm not afraid of the political process. I've lived a large chunk of my adult life participating in the political process. But the political process today is unlike anything that I've ever seen. Nothing complicated seems to be able to get done. And the only way that you can get things done that are remotely complicated is through a series of compromises. And I'll be honest with you, that level of governing, that level of policy making scares me in the context of telecom reform, Because the way to reform the Telecom Act is not to take the 20 hot issues around which there's no consensus and let's compromise. Let's give the bells this issue, and we'll give cable that issue, and we'll give the consumer groups this issue, and in doing that, we'll put a hodgepodge together of Solomon-like division of the baby and end up with a new telecom regime that in the end may be significantly more counterproductive than the old style regime that we have right now, which pretty clearly is not very well designed for the fast-moving economy, internet, broadband, video, and wireless economy that we have today. So I don't know what we want. I'll be honest with you. I actually think what Greg Walden and Fred Upton are doing is pretty smart, which is they're starting a dialogue and a discussion, and they're going to try and bring stakeholders together. And I think that part of that process needs to be whether we can agree on a set of high-level principles and then get that compact pursuant to which all the stakeholders buy in that we're not going to just hodgepodge amend the act and amend the parts of the act that we can get consensus on, but we're going to try and create a work product that actually meets the goals of that set of high-level principles that we've built consensus around. The one thing I think I'm pretty confident about is that I don't see comprehensive telecom reform happening in the next Congress. But that's because I'm not sure I see anything meaningful happening in the next Congress. So join the crowd. I think the risk that we have in the next Congress is whether with the impatience of how long and difficult it is to put together a comprehensive rewrite of the Telecom Act, that people try and peel off individual issues and divide the baby on those individual issues. And there's, I guess, always the potential that something smaller could happen. But I think it's going to take at least 2 Congresses to be able to get to the end of the road in terms of comprehensive telecom reform. I see here with no capacity to see anyone. So,
You can identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Dave Burstein, and as the guy who writes the DSL industry news, I should be very happy at what I'm hearing, especially because I've been arguing with Susan Crawford on whether cable has won for a long time. Unfortunately, Saturday I broke the news that AT&T has frozen the remaining 5 million lines of Project VIP. Possibly because of the DirecTV merger. But I promised you 2 questions that you'd really like. And I said
everything, Dave, I love you. Anything is in the mind of the beholder. So,
well, they can judge whether
it's fine.
these are
They're
questions.
They're good questions. So
they're
go
good
ahead.
questions. I sent them to my head so I could get good answers. I don't have to surprise them on it. Okay. The first thing is that you have by far the most effective program to get people connected to the internet. Your $10 for poor families is really working, and I happen to work in that field. He's done it right. On the other hand, Time Warner has just agreed to eliminate the throttling on my cable modem that keeps it down at 15 meg, and has promised to give me by the end of the year 50 meg for the same price they're currently managing at for 15. Now, if there was a merger between the two of you to happen, do you think you'd make Washington happy by bringing your $10 to poor families to Time Warner and the 50 megabits for a decent price to Comcast?
So we've already promised to bring Internet Essentials to the Time Warner cable footprint, and I can't predict what the Department of Justice or the FCC reaction may be to that. I can tell you that mayors and city council members and state legislators and nonprofit groups around the country are ecstatic with that commitment. And it's something that they've been looking and waiting for a very long time. And I'm going to make a separation, which is sometimes some members of the press would like to make it appear that the only reason why we do anything is in order to get transactions approved. That's not our motivation for Internet Essentials. Our motivation for Internet Essentials is to do our part in closing the digital divide. And I think by expanding the program to the Time Warner Cable footprint and offering the program in cities like New York and Dallas and Los Angeles and Charlotte, we are going to put ourselves in a position to really move the needle in closing the digital divide, and that's what my goal is. In terms of I'm not being a Time Warner Cable customer and not having access to any Time Warner Cable data. You'll be pleased, our FTC regulators will be pleased to know that that is the case. Other than what we read in the newspapers and what we hear from reporters, I'm not privy to Time Warner Cable's pricing decisions. What I do know is that on the Comcast side, we have increased our internet speeds 13 times in the last 12 years. A very, very small minority of our customers now have internet speeds as slow as 15 meg down. Our flagship product is now 25 meg down, migrating to 50 meg down. And we now have a significant number of customers at 100 meg down and customers at 300 meg down and 500 meg down. So I think one of the big consumer benefits of our transaction is the faster internet speeds overall that Comcast provides as compared to Time Warner Cable. And I think that as we invest to bring the Time Warner Cable plant to an all-digital plant, that is what ultimately enables us to bring Time Warner Cable's internet speeds up to the level of performance of Comcast internet speeds. And I do think that is one of the significant pro-consumer benefits of our transaction.
Second one, again friendly. He does. When I walk around Paris with an iPad, I see 3 Wi-Fi clouds, one from SFR, one from Bouygues, one from Free, all of which is done by technology that you're ready to deploy. The second SSID on everybody's home gateway. There are 12 million of them in France and more coming in Germany. And that clearly, we've seen in Europe, dramatically reduces the need for additional spectrum and allows the wireless guys to give us enough capacity that maybe the wireless would be a more serious competitor to broadband than it is today. So the question I have for you is the public interest benefits are really obvious to this, but what would be the good public policy that would persuade AT&T out of their district, Verizon out of their district, to come to you and cut a deal that they could use this enormous amount of capacity that's currently sitting idle so that they wouldn't need so much expensive spectrum?
So the good news is that we Comcast do have the largest and most robust Wi-Fi network in the country today. By the end of the year, we will have 8 million Wi-Fi hotspots, the vast majority of those generated by in-home second antennas on our routers. I think the even better news is that we don't really need the government to help here, and we really don't need a commercial arrangement to help here, because I think what we're seeing is a consumer-driven shifting of their mobile applications to Wi-Fi from the wireless networks to Wi-Fi whenever it is that they have the opportunity to do so. And that's because of better price, better service. Just think of your own, I think of my own, I'll do my own, think of my own personal use. Whenever I have the option to be on Wi-Fi as opposed to on 4G or LTE, I'm opting to be on Wi-Fi. And the telcos don't have any problem with this for exactly the reason that you said, which is that it does relieve pressure on their wireless networks. And even if they're using, whether it's our Wi-Fi network or the hotel Wi-Fi network or any Wi-Fi network that they're using, it is relieving congestion on the wireless network. So the way I look at the future here, there's going to be consumer-driven migration from the wireless networks to Wi-Fi whenever and wherever that's available. And the more ubiquitous Wi-Fi networks are, the more consumers will divert more of their usage to Wi-Fi networks instead of wireless networks. I think that's what led Cisco in its analytic work to conclude that by 2018, 88% of the data traffic in America will be over Wi-Fi networks, not over wireless networks. And it's part of the way in which this overall ecosystem works together as a matter of business and consumer imperative.
Hey, David. Tony Rahm from Politico back here. You talked about the Comcast-Time Warner Cable deal as the 800-pound elephant in the room, but that's not the only merger right now. There are plenty others proposed and contemplated. And you also talked about bigness by itself not being a reason to approve a telecom transaction. So I'd love to hear you address the trend of media consolidation at this moment, and what is too big? What counts to you as too big?
So for the record, I didn't say that bigness shouldn't be a reason to approve the transaction. I said bigness shouldn't be a reason to disapprove the transaction, the exact opposite. So I'm a believer, as I think the Justice Department and the FCC is, in viewing individual transactions on their own merit. And so I'm very focused, obviously, on the Comcast-Time Warner Cable transaction. All I can tell you is that that transaction does not create a company that is too big. I think we have demonstrated that and will continue to demonstrate that repeatedly. In fact, as I said, the major business rationale for the transaction is to enable us to get to a sufficient scale where we are in a better position to compete with our national and global competitors in this space. Every one of our significant competitors is larger than us, either in revenues, market capitalization, number of customers, and or national or global reach. And as we look down the road 5 years from now, we think we need the additional scale to enable us to continue to invest, to continue to innovate, to enable us to be able to compete against the rest of that ecosystem. And that makes this transaction pro-competitive and pro-consumer and strongly in the public interest. Obviously, at some point, a company would get too big, but it's a hypothetical question because the transaction we currently have in front of us does, I believe, demonstrably does not create a company that is too big. If we tried to get to a point where we controlled 50 or 70% of the multi-channel video subscribers, I think that would raise obvious vertical implications in the market. If we tried to acquire Dish, which we compete against in every market of the country, I think the horizontal implications of that transaction would be problematic. So again, there are so many variations here. If we tried to acquire Netflix, I'd have the same response, which is we're competing with Netflix. That presents horizontal issues that I think are much clearer than the issues that are presented in our transaction. So I hope you'll understand that my focus is on our transaction. I think that's where the Department of Justice and where the FCC focus will be. And I think that our transaction demonstrably does not create a company that is too big, but in fact creates a company that is better positioned to compete and to provide consumer benefit and increased development and innovation for the next 5 to 10 years. And that's why I think the transaction is totally approvable.
Any other questions?
Almost.
David, what, other than the transaction getting through, competitively, regulatorily, legally, what keeps you up at night?
So as every member of my team knows, nothing keeps me up at night because I don't sleep anyway. Look, when I look at our overall ecosystem, I'm probably more worried about what's happening in the open internet space right now than I am with anything else, because I do believe that the wrong answer in that space, for all the reasons that I've explained, runs a risk to, if not destroy, to impede one of the great American success stories over the past decade, which is private investment in broadband networks that have brought America to a leading role in broadband and has generated hundreds of thousands of jobs. And so as a Comcast executive, but I think more importantly as a student of politics, as an American citizen, as somebody who's vitally interested in the overall internet ecosystem and in the United States' overall position of competitive advantage in the technology and innovation space. I think that the upcoming decision on the open internet is certainly one of the most important decisions that we have confronted as a nation in a long while. So that is a central element of interest. It's not a level of concern yet, it's a level of interest for me. Probably not expected, but when I think about the things that worry me and that worry me about our country, which is, as I said, I may be a Comcast executive, but I'm a citizen of the United States. I am beyond upset and beyond concerned about the level of partisanship that exists in federal and state governments around the country, the lack of civility in politics. And although I'm not saying that any or all of this is related, but it only takes an incident like what we're seeing in Ferguson, Missouri, to remind me just how the 1 millimeter below the surface that racial tensions and divides that still exist in this country. That worries me. And I think the common denominator is what I'd call the lack of civility in politics, lack of civility in the way in which we treat each other and we treat other people, and then ultimately how a single incident can, and I'm not being critical of anyone's reactions here, and I really mean that, but whether it's a police officer using a chokehold in Manhattan, or a police officer shooting a young African-American male in Ferguson, or a town watch person shooting an African-American male in Florida, when you see these incidents and you see the ruptures and the disruption that it creates in our society, it is something that certainly worries me. And if I were sleeping, it's something I would lose a lot of sleep over. And then the third thing I would mention, and again, not trying to duck our industry, but the third thing I would mention is that I really do have unbelievably serious concerns about what's going on in the Middle East, and the Middle East writ large. I'm not just talking about Israel and Gaza, but I'm talking about Iran and Iran having a nuclear capacity. And the scariest thing for me about the Mideast is that when you look at the recent outbreak in Gaza, that if countries like Egypt and Jordan were squarely in opposition to what Hamas was doing, but they had no ability and no impact in being able to control it. And that's so much more dangerous in my mind than Egypt and Syria and Lebanon not being happy with what Israel's doing, but having some capacity to influence events in the Middle East. So I think if there's a tinderbox in the world, I think that tinderbox remains the Mideast. And the dynamics have changed so significantly in that region over the last 5 years that I'm just not sure I understand right now that if you ever hit a true crisis, who it is who would be able to control bad actors and what it is that they might do. And it's a pretty scary situation for me. So those are intentional answers, and again, Rebecca and Joe and Rudy are here, and they know one of the things that I always talk to people about, notwithstanding how hard we work, but there's a lot going on in our lives and a lot going on in the world that extends beyond Comcast and Time Warner Cable and international internet governance and all the topics that we talk about here, starting with our families, but in terms of the scheme of the world of things that I worry about, I have to stretch to find a telecom-related issue that belongs on that list. So thanks, everyone.